Ever since I entered, well, it was even before medical school, probably in college, as you're going through all of the biology courses that I had to go through for pre-med, the more I would study about the human body, and especially you get into things like the brain, the more I would realize, you know what, this is an incredibly complex thing that I can't buy into the evolution of it. I could buy into macroevolution pretty easily, like, originally we had 4 molars, now we're down to 3 molars. Okay, I can go with that. That's not a big leap of faith to realize that natural selection will not only select for something that gives us an advantage in life, but it will also select against something that doesn't serve any purpose anymore. Eventually, in another 1,000 years, we probably won't have an appendix to worry about having that removed, and who knows what else might be missing. But nevertheless, I got more and more fascinated with this subject. Of course, everybody on campus, at a secular campus, I went to UCI when it was brand new, everybody there is just gung-ho for evolution. Everything could be explained by evolution, and any religious zealot that thought that creationism is what accounted for many of the things that we see today around us, they were just plain stupid. They just didn't know anything. They were denying the facts of evolution, and so we're going to discuss that today and discuss a little bit about what is fact and what is fiction. So today, I'm going to introduce a term to you. Some of you may know it, some of you may not. Irreducible complexity. What is it, and how does it fit into this whole conversation that I'm talking about? Evolution versus intelligent design. The definition of irreducible complexity is a single system which is composed of several interacting parts that contribute to some basic function, where the removal of any one of those basic parts causes the whole system to fail. Okay, so if you want a little more complex version of that, you can read this, and it's not going to say anything more than what I just told you. It just uses fancier words. But here's an example of a real basic, irreducibly complex machine, the old mousetrap. Okay, there's probably 5 parts in this thing. There's a latch, there's a bar, there's a spring, there's a base that you attach everything to, and then finally there's a piece of cheese to entice some poor schlep into coming along and trying this out. You remove any one of those parts, and you're not going to catch a darn thing. So that's an example of irreducible complexity in its simplest form. Now, if you want to go to nature, here's another example of one. This is just a bacterial flagellum. This is what moves certain bacteria through the water. Now, keep in mind, this is a single cell organism, okay? So what you're looking at on the screen there, that's not a bunch of cells. This is just a subcellular component of that one cell. And for those of you who are somewhat mechanically minded, notice that there's a stator, there's a rotor, there's a bushing, there's a hook, and finally there's the flagellum, which serves as the propeller. It looks a heck of a lot like an outboard motor to me. And when you analyze it, that's exactly what this is. And then along came the electron microscope, and if you look on the far left, you'll see an electron micrograph of this actual machine. This isn't something made up that somebody just drew on a slide for me to take a picture of and show it here. This is the actual electron micrograph. The width of that stator at the bottom is 20 nanometers. Now, you've all heard of nanotechnology. I don't know how many of you know what the heck a nanometer is, but we're going to discuss that in a second. But 20 nanometers, that's less than our visible light, the wavelength of light. So what's a nanometer? Glad you asked, okay? Take a meter. A meter is what, 3 feet? Well, it's 39 inches. That's close to what I'm talking about here. Divide that meter into 1,000 segments. You now have 1,000 millimeters. Take 1 millimeter, divide that into 1,000, and you have 1,000 micrometers, or micrometers as some people say. Take 1 micrometer, and divide that into 1,000, and you now have 1 nanometer. Okay, so start with the meter and take 1/1000th of that meter. That's a nanometer. Now, wavelength of light is roughly 400 to 700 nanometers. We also call a nanometer an angstrom. It depends on what area of physics you're dealing with. But it's a nanometer equals an angstrom for all intents and purposes. So now you know how small that structure actually is. 20 nanometers across. That's all it is. And it's an engine. It's a functional motor that propels that flagellum from 6,000 to 17,000 RPMs. It can stop in 1/4 of a turn and reverse. We don't have a motor that can do that. Okay? There is no human-built motor that can match that stupid little motor right there. It's more powerful than we have. Okay, moving along, Jeffrey Simmons, who is an MD, which is why I migrated to him, wrote a book that was called What Darwin Didn't Know. In the 1860s, Civil War days, a cell was nothing more to them than kind of a blob of gelatin. They knew there were cells, but they didn't really know much about them, what was in them. Their microscopes were very rudimentary at that time, and they saw very little in the way of structure inside the cells. But what we know today, and I'm just going to throw this out there, there's at least, that 17, I should have put at least in there, all or nothing human body systems. In other words, you take something out of any one of those systems and the whole system fails. And these combine with many others to form our entire human body. It's a system of systems that are all interrelated, very complexly, and we'll discuss that a little bit here. And it's totally irreducible at many levels, all the way from gross anatomy to looking at somebody and seeing their whole body, all the way down to the microscopic molecular protein enzyme level. There's basically 3 characteristics that we have to consider as to whether something is either evolutionary or whether it is got to be considered designed. Did it have to happen? Was this something that was inevitably going to happen by the laws of physics anyway? Did it happen by some accident, like a lightning bolt hitting the primordial ooze along with a couple of molecules of water and maybe an amino acid that somehow happened along, and out from that springs a living cell? And did an intelligent agent cause it to happen? We're going to discuss that. It's a matter of statistics. All of these questions, or none of these questions, can be answered definitively. Irreducible complexity is more of a game of statistics. What is the chance that this essential thing we're talking about could have spontaneously developed by accident? And in the case of what we're discussing, irreducibly complex systems, that chance approaches mathematical negligibility. Okay, it becomes a very, very small number. You can never say with absolute certainty. But this is the problem that evolutionists have today. They start with dead matter in the upper left hand of their blackboard there, and they end up with life over on the right-hand side. And they really can't come up with any answers in between. It's just then a miracle occurs or emergence occurs. And so the professor is telling his grad student, I think you might have to actually prove step 2. And that's where they're at for the most part today. Let's take an example. All of you know about a heart. Most of us could not survive without one unless you happen to have an artificial heart implanted in you. So one would die without that. One would die also without a lot of other things in our body, but let's also just throw hemoglobin in there for good measure, since that's associated with the heart. Hemoglobin is what carries our oxygen around in our red blood cells. Even with an intact heart and hemoglobin, by themselves, they don't serve much of a function in our bodies, because we have diseases today that if the heart beats too fast or too slow, that can be just as lethal as having no heart at all. And the same thing happens with hemoglobin. We can be either overloaded with hemoglobin or we can be grossly under loaded with hemoglobin, both of which are either unhealthy or lethal. So there have to be systems in place, and this is sort of the key of irreducible complexity that no evolutionist can explain away. You have to not only form a heart de novo, but at the same time regulatory feedback loop systems to control the heart. Because if you create a heart that's beating 500 times a minute like a hummingbird, and doing that in a human being, you're dead. Okay, it doesn't have time to fill up with blood between each beat, and your cardiac output drops to zero, and you're going to die. By the same token, if it's beating twice a minute, you're going to die from that too. So there has to be spontaneously the whole nervous system and the enzyme system to support the feedback of how that heart is going to beat properly. If you go out, sitting here right now, you're at a baseline of your heart, it's somewhere around 60 to 80, unless you're on medication that would change it. You go outside and run a mile around the block, hopefully your heart's going to beat faster, okay? That's regulation. If you didn't have that regulatory mechanism, you would still die. All right, so remember this is a key. All the feedback and regulatory systems that are in place in our body, there are just thousands and thousands of them. That's what makes human beings and the higher vertebrates very unique. You cannot evolve into that because everything would have to arise spontaneously on multiple different fronts, and that's not going to happen statistically. Now, we all know original purposes of a structure can change. Anybody that's raised a kid understands that. Give him a wooden spoon and a set of pans, and he's no longer going to be using the spoon for a spoon purpose, and nor is he going to use the pan to fill anything up. He will develop a set of drums out of it. And the same thing happens with a lot of things in cells. It's called co-opting or co-optioning. You can take something from another cell, and if the two somehow get together and get it on some Saturday night, they can merge together and incorporate, like if a virus gets eaten up by a bacteria, some of the viral DNA can be incorporated into the bacterial DNA and create something new in that bacteria. Okay, we all know that that can happen. We can prove that even in today's laboratory. But virtually every aspect of our human physiology has these complex regulatory and feedback loop elements in it, and developing these components require thousands of interacting genes leading to the specific expression of these various proteins and enzymes. The human body itself in total represents an irreducibly complex system, both at the organ system, like the heart, but also clear down at the molecular system, like forming insulin, okay? Evolution falls flat on its face. It can't prove even one irreducibly complex system and how it came about, let alone the interdependent web of all of these systems that comprise the human body, most of which had to be developed at the same time because there would be no way to naturally select for a heart. If you had some rudimentary heart in a bacterial cell, for instance, nature will select against it because it can't control it, it can't do anything with it, it has no input, it has an output, but it can't be regulated. So natural selection states that we will not support something that's just going to require us putting energy into it, using up ATP on it, and yet it has no useful purpose, so it'll select against it. So the heart would quickly be eliminated out of that bacteria since it couldn't be controlled. Okay, let's move into the beginning of the human body. Let's start with a cell. Now, I'm not even going to talk about two haploids coming together to make a diploid. Hopefully most of you know what that means. That in itself is an incredible miracle, okay? That is just unbelievably complex. But let's just start with the diploid cell.
Okay.
Most of you have seen this in some biology class somewhere, I hope, that you took at one time, whether junior high, high school, or college. And this is just a very rudimentary schematic of a cell. The purple area there is the central processing unit, otherwise known as the nucleus. It's packed with DNA, which is what gives everything function. And then all of these supporting players are in the outside of the nucleus area, in the endoplasmic reticulum, if you remember that. And we're not going to go into all of the structures and functions of it all, but just remember that you have got within each cell, a complete functioning like a city. And here's the explanation of it. It has factories for building supplies. It has packaging centers for transporting those supplies. It has little trucks that move the materials along designed or designated pathways within the cell to get it from point A to point B. It communicates within itself. It has hospitals for repairing injuries. It has a massive library in the form of your DNA coiled up inside your nucleus. It's greater than the Library of Congress, all coded in DNA. It has power stations for making energy. It has garbage removal. It has a wall for protection. It has city gates that only allow certain things in and out through those pores in the cell membranes. It's an entire city. And just to give you a little bit of insight, to think that a cell could arise by evolution bit by bit, again, you have to explain, well, okay, why would an enzyme form inside of a cell if it didn't have a purpose? It's not, okay? It would quickly be selected against that. Or why would RNA form without DNA? Why would DNA form in the first place? DNA is so complex. And think about what DNA actually is. It is computer code. It's on the order of base 4. You have 4 unique bases that comprise your DNA. And they are in a very specific sequence, in an order from point A to point B on a chromosome. And your body, each cell, knows how to read that sequencing of the codes or of the bases on the DNA. So in order to make, I'm on this slide. In order to make an enzyme, let's just say an insulin molecule, since I mentioned that earlier, your DNA has to uncoil at the point where it's coded for insulin molecule. It uncoils, it splits apart in half, and it makes an RNA, a messenger RNA molecule. That's the mirror image now of that DNA. It's the opposite coding, but it does that for a reason. That messenger RNA now goes outside the nucleus into a ribosome, and it feeds through like a ticker tape through the ribosome. The ribosome reads the codes in the sequence that they're presented to it, and it produces one by one an amino acid, and it just keeps adding these amino acids together. It knows how to coil the amino acid on itself, how to bridge them together at certain points. And an insulin molecule is, if I remember correctly, 91 amino acids all coiled together. It's not a straight line. It's got a specific form and shape to it. And there you go. But now you've made this insulin molecule. What if you made too much insulin? Well, what feeds back to the cell to tell it to shut up and turn itself off? Or what turns it on in the first place and tells it to produce insulin? Okay? This is where evolution has a problem. You can maybe explain how it evolved into making the insulin molecule, but boy, you got to bridge a lot of gaps to get to that point. But then what about all the feedback mechanisms to tell it when to turn on, when to turn off? Because in a normal human that doesn't have diabetes, that function takes place. I don't know how many of you consciously spend a lot of time each day thinking about how much insulin you need to produce. My guess is none of you. And that holds true with every function that's going on in our bodies today. So that feedback loop up there with the DNA, RNA, and then an enzyme, It looks simple on a piece of paper or on a slide, but in reality, there's a lot involved in that. You know, it has to be turned on, it has to be turned off, and then the actual production of it is an incredible miracle in and of itself. Okay, let's go to what I started off talking about that got me interested in this topic in the first place, the human brain or the nervous system. Steve might be the only one that recognizes my notation there. 10E15 is exponential notation because my PowerPoint won't make a superscript. This is 10 to the 15th power. Most of us can't even think about what 10 to the 6th power is. That's a million. That's hard to get your mind around, but 10 to the 15th, that's a number that we don't have a name for it. It's not like it's a quadrillion or anything like that. Let's take half the United States. That's roughly, continental United States, that's roughly 1 million square miles. In each square mile, I want you to plant 10,000 trees in every square mile of that million square miles that we're talking about. And then on every tree, I want you to make sure that there's 100,000 leaves. Okay, for every brain that's in this room, that's at least the number of connections that you have. Nerve cell to nerve cell to nerve cell. Okay? It's an incredible number of neuronal synapses or connections that we have in our brain. Here's just one example of a Purkinje cell that's in the cerebellum, which is where we coordinate a lot of our activities. Just the ability to balance on your 2 feet, you know, without falling over. That's the cerebellum. Okay? The ability to do rapid, repetitive motions like touching your fingers independently, sequentially, one after another. By the way, the inability to do this is known as dysdiadochokinesis. I want you to remember that term. Whenever I see dysdiadochokinesis in somebody, first off, I yell because you never see it, but I love to give that example to my nursing staff and say, do you know what that is? So a densely branching Purkinje cell is in the cerebellum. And this is just a drawing. This doesn't even come close to the number of synapses that we're talking about. Okay? Now notice there's only one output. There's only one axon that comes out of that nerve cell, and that's the usual case. Most nerve cells only have one output. Everything is input. And the reason for that, let's talk about this first. I love this slide. I couldn't resist putting it in here. So our fastest computers today can get up somewhere around 1 billion or so executions a second. But when you take a fly at rest, it's already doing 100 billion executions a second, just sitting there on your table waiting for you to smash it with a fly swatter. The human nervous system is infinitely more complex than that of a fly. So think how many executions we're performing per second. Okay, it is just, I don't think there is a number that we have come up with for that. There's 4 main functions of the nervous system. You can almost kind of intuitively guess these. One is just inputting things. Touch a hot stove, you feel heat, but that's all you're doing there. If you didn't have anything else, your finger would fry on that stove. Then there's transmission. You have to get that signal from here to some part of your body that's going to do something about it. Okay? Then there's the integration aspect of it, okay? It has to go through some thinking process to determine, is this a dangerous situation? Should I maybe warn something about, moving? And then finally is the response or the output. So all 4 of these functions are necessary in order to have a nervous system to be functional. I mean, all 4, again, you can evolve a nerve that can feel the heat, but did it also evolve at the same time, the whole brain, to process it and tell it what to do with that input? So if you can sense, transmit, and integrate, that's great. That's 3 out of 4, but your brain is still worthless at that point because you can't tell the finger to move off of the stove. There's no output. Or conversely, if you could transmit, integrate, and respond, but there would be no input. In other words, you touch the stove and you leave your finger there because there's no input going to your nervous system to tell, hey, I'm on a hot stove. It would just sit there and your finger would burn. Okay, so maybe your nose would eventually smell the burning flesh and do something about it, I don't know. So are we to believe that 4 functions could evolve simultaneously? And again, we're down to mathematical probability. It would be a very, very small number, a chance of developing these 4 functions simultaneously. Because if you developed 3 of the 4, which is great, natural selection would still select against it because it had no use for it. It's not doing the cell any good, or the organism. Back in 45, Nobel Prize winner Sir Ernst Chain, who was a German, he put it pretty succinctly. He said, "I'd rather believe in fairy tales than in such wild speculation. I've said for years that you think about the origin of life and it leads to no useful purpose, as even the simplest living system is far too complex to be understood in terms of the extremely primitive chemistry that scientists have used in their attempts to explain the unexplainable." And then he puts it like we would put it: God cannot be explained away by such naive thoughts. I mean, we're talking complex. You saw the bacterial flagellum. That's a subcellular component, and look how complex that is. That's not even one cell. Okay, here's one that I figured the ladies would relate to.
That's very sexist.
Everybody, is that sexist? All animals have tears of one sort or another to lubricate their corneas. I mean, you can't pretty much survive without it. Tears are multifunctional. They're made of oils and mucins and electrolytes and bacterial fighting substances, and they help reduce the risk of us getting eye infections. And their functions are just so myriad, but so essential. For the cornea, they provide a smoother optical surface so that our vision remains clear. It also keeps it moisturized. It also provides the cornea with oxygen. The cornea has no blood vessels going into it. If you had blood vessels, you wouldn't be able to see through the cornea. So it has to get its oxygen supply via other means, which is through the tears. For the eye in general, tears kind of act as a wiper fluid that allow the eyelids to wash the eye free of debris with every blink that you do. And it takes away, every time you blink, there's a couple thousand of your epithelial cells coming off of your eye that get washed away. So just think of what life would be like. Joseph Calkin, who's dedicated over 2.5 decades of his life studying nothing more than the tear, I can't believe it. He says, we're so used to taking for granted the enormous complexity of every component in the body that we have just become numb to the true miracle that even the tear film is. He says, without tears, life would be drastically different for us. In the short run, our eyes would be extremely uncomfortable, and in the long run, our eyesight, which is so important to our quality of life, would be altogether impossible. The eye's tear mechanism is just one of the many body systems which works so well, and we take it for granted every day. It's just another one of those things that arose spontaneously, evolved. By the way, we're the only animal that can cry or laugh and have tears, okay? We're the only animal that has emotional tears. Okay, the eye. This is always one that the evolutionists love to bring up because they say we can refute creationism by explaining that the eye could indeed form step by step. There's a lot going on in an eye today. And here's just a rough schematic of it. We're not, again, going to get into it. Weighs 7 or 8 grams, which is less than a sugar cube weighs. And it's just jam-packed full of different structures, but most importantly, it's jam-packed full of various enzymes back in the retina. It has to take, right now, as you're looking at the slide, you're focusing light from the screen into light-sensitive rods and cones in the back of your eye. And as it hits those rods and cones, it's converting it into chemical signals through enzymes that are back there, which then end up as electrical signals, which gets carried by the optic nerve to your visual cortex. And then that raw information has to get filtered and patched together so that you can then make some sort of sense out of what you're seeing on the screen right now. The evolutionists say, well, we can explain this using prototype eyes, where a simple organism would develop maybe a little pigment of light-sensitive material or protein on its surface, and it can maybe sense light versus dark. And then over a few thousand years, it starts cupping down inwards and sort of making an indentation in the cell wall with the pigment at the bottom, which is where our retina would be, and then eventually the tops come together to restrict the light coming in and help focus the light so that now it can see forms and that sort of thing. So a proto-eye with just pigment only, maybe you can sense light versus dark. And if you sense light, you know, okay, I'm out in the open, anybody can see me, I'm going to get eaten. And so you would scurry to find a dark place, and now you're in the dark if you're a bacterial cell, and hopefully you will not get eaten. The only problem is you have to have a feedback mechanism. Once again, we keep coming up against this one part. Yeah, you can make an eye. You can theorize how an eye might have, evolved over thousands of years. But how did the feedback mechanism occur? I just gave you the example. If you could sense light versus dark, and you knew you had to get out of the light to get into safety, how did you understand that? Okay, something had to be connected to that dumb little piece of pigment on the cell wall to allow you to know that. So something else had to occur at the same time, spontaneously, to allow you to move. And this is where always the evolutionary theory starts falling apart. They can't prove all of the things that has to happen simultaneously in order to make that eye work. So that pigmented patch, if it happened because a photon hit the DNA just right and mutated it in some way, it would be selected against because it served no purpose. Why should we bother wasting energy supporting this patch of pigment out here if it's not going to serve a purpose that we can use? Okay. One of the most complex things that we have in our body to explain is the ability to clot our blood. This is always one that's brought up quite frequently in the discussion of evolutionism versus creationism. First off, blood clotting is not essential. We don't need to clot our blood. However, if you want to live very long, you're going to need to have that. Obviously, animals, if they get bitten, if they didn't have the ability to clot, they would just literally bleed to death from every superficial wound that they would get, and so would we. But there is no law in physics, which was one of our previous slides, that requires a clotting of blood in order to live. But the mechanism by which blood clots is so complex. Again, we're back to the math of this. It's extremely unlikely that it occurred spontaneously without divine intervention. Now, this next slide, I want you to memorize it. This is how we clot our blood. I won't spend a lot of time on it. It reminds me of when I would walk into my biochem labs back in college, and they would have these huge charts on the wall of protein synthesis. And of course there's a zillion different proteins, but they would have these big circles. Something goes in at the top, it hits this big circle, goes round and round, comes out at the bottom and goes into another big cycle of something that goes round and round, drops into a third one, and finally comes out the bottom as who knows what, L-alanine or something like that, an amino acid. It just blew my mind away that anybody has actually figured all of that stuff out. This goes on in our cells all day long using the food that we have eaten. So I think most of us are reduced to this. I don't have to explain this slide. You just know there's a lot of things you don't understand, okay? I don't understand it. I doubt you do. It's so complex. Thank God that there is a God, okay? And He knows. Yeah, when I get to heaven, I'm pulling the videotape on not only the creation of the world, but how our bodies were created. There's a few things I want to pull the videotape on and just spend an eternity watching that, besides sitting at the foot of God. Could the human body have evolved? Can some other creature have evolved into us? It would require far more than just the expected random mutation and natural selection, as I've just shown you. Because yes, you can mutate one system, maybe, but can you mutate all of the systems that would be needed to support that one system simultaneously? That's the problem. A wonderfully constructed human body is exactly what an all-wise creator would make. And he promised us that those who trust in him will one day inherit new bodies that don't fade away. I'm looking forward to that. Knowing what we have here on earth makes me really curious what we're going to have in heaven. And just as a body, though one, has many parts, all of its many parts form one body. So it is with Christ. We were all baptized in one spirit so as to form one body. It doesn't matter whether we're Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, we were all given one spirit. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. God used the blueprint that he used for our bodies, used it for the church, used it for, all of us together, collectively. And it's right out of 1 Corinthians. It's there for anybody to read. The Bible also says, this is David, several thousand years ago, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb, and I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." David doesn't understand the cellular level. He doesn't know a darn thing about that. He just knows that he's complex. God made him. He knew what he was going to be like even before he was created. "My frame was not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret inside of his mother," in other words, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, "your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet I didn't even have any days under my belt." There were no days. Psalm 139, if you want to go and read the whole thing. Isn't that incredible? I am always amazed. God knew all of this long before the Big Bang even occurred. So one final thought, just so that you don't walk out of here thinking I have definitively proved or disproven anything. Irreducible complexity is not proof of creation, but it certainly tilts the balance scales in the direction of creationism, and it's compelling enough where you have to sit down and think and ask yourself, what if the Bible's right? Science has never answered very many questions for us about where civilizations could be located, ancient civilizations, but if you go to the Bible and look up areas where those civilizations are mentioned and find out where geographically they were located on the map, you can go and use our sonar devices that we have, and you can literally see the civilization down at 100 feet or so under the earth, and you can dig down and get to these. The Bible always tends to answer what science can't answer. It's not the other way around. So keep that in mind. That's it, guys. All right. Now for the 5,000 questions. Let's get that off. Okay, Jim.
Okay, let's be clear before I make this comment. I'm creationist all the way. God made us.
Okay, you're going to play devil's advocate.
Yeah. Evolution is ridiculous, if only for the fact that if things tend to tear apart, it's supposed to put together. Okay, but in all of your examples up there, you quote the mathematical unlikelihood of all this stuff happening.
Mm-hmm.
Don't they explain that away by saying time? That's why it took millions and millions. Okay, you say it's infinitesimal, this many nano whatevers that this could possibly even happen. Well, by admitting that, aren't you saying that if we had that many years over the course of time since whenever it was began, that you're admitting that there is a possibility that this could have happened.
Okay, Jim, I understand your question.
Okay,
Stop.
good.
Let me answer. You're comparing creation versus evolution. Creation gets you down to an infinitesimally small number of probability. However, evolution leaves a much larger gap mathematically. Not only that, but like that one cartoon slide that I showed you where they have to prove step number 2, they can't do it. They have a greater problem moving from dead inorganic material to living organic material than we have in explaining it. Now, they always say that when we get to this situation, we use the God of the gaps. Whenever we come up against a gap, we put God in there. Oh, that has to be a God thing. Well, evolution does it even more so than we do. Well, it had to be a Darwin thing, and they have a much bigger gap that they have to branch across. So, sure, I mean, you can compare mathematical probabilities of one versus the other, but the creationist version at least reduces it to about as small a number as you can get without it being an absolute zero.
So we use the same arguments. There's just...
Yeah, and they've done computerized models of how frequent mutations would occur. And the Earth has not been around long enough to go from anything inorganic. Even if you can say, okay, let's put a living cell at the beginning of the Earth. Let's give them a head start. Let's just say there was one living cell and it could divide, okay, and replicate itself. They still can't get to any complex animal in the entire length of time that the Earth has been here. So what they have to then say is, well, a meteorite came and brought something alien but living onto our Earth and contaminated our Earth with something from outer space, and that gave us that jump and head start. But then we still can't make it from bacteria to human beings. Okay.
So the odds don't match, even their projection of the millions of years.
Yeah, the computer projections do not match up.
Thank you. I've got to keep that in mind.
Somebody back there, yes.
You already answered. I was going to say basically the same thing you said about that time factor.
Yeah.
That it hasn't been long enough for...
No, not even close. I don't know if there is enough time in the universe to evolve what they're saying had to evolve.
And the other thing I was going to say is like, a question to an evolutionist would be, how did it know?
How do they what?
How did it know everything for the body? How did it know? In other words, there's an intelligence behind it.
Well, they didn't. They were just hoping that we wouldn't bring up the argument that even if you evolved a heart, you would have to evolve a nervous system to support the heart, and they can't explain that away. They fall on their face every time on that one. Galen, I'm sorry I insulted you when I said Steve would be the only one that knew what 10e to the 15 meant. So forgive me. Now go ahead and blast me.
No, I just wanted to say that all of that would have had to take place, and there is a time limit. It's not infinite. It's 4.5 billion years.
Yes, correct.
Unless, and Dr. Crick, who discovered DNA
In the 50s.
has said that cannot happen. So he also believes in transpermeation, which is coming, like you had mentioned, coming from outer space, something.
Yeah, if you don't want to believe in creationism, you have to go to the meteorite contaminating our Earth. Yes, Mark.
Make a comment?
Yeah.
It's not just 4.5 billion years. It's more like 500 million. Because the instant that conditions on Earth were right for life, it didn't completely hospitable before. The
Correct.
instant practically that life could it appeared just instantly. It didn't. God created the instant that He had finished preparing the Earth to accept life.
So Marge, for those on this side that can't hear her soft little delicate voice, is basically saying it's much longer than the 4.5 because I mean much larger than 4.5 million years because the conditions that existed at the beginning of Earth, which was like 500 million or whatever. I mean, it depends on who you talk to on this. It doesn't matter. the conditions were totally inhospitable, nothing but like volcanoes going off. But then again, that's how we made windshields. You know, it melted the sand, and we got windshields out of that. You've all seen the Edsels parked out in the desert, haven't you? Yeah. Okay. Jim, you had a question.
Yeah, just a comment, but I was just going to say to that point, who created that one cell? Who created a meteor? Who created a solar system? So I think, you know, just to go to the very base of that, okay, something doesn't evolve out of nothing. There was something. There was, even if we say there was dead or inorganic matter, somebody created that.
Right. And to follow up on Jen's comment, you know, who created the first single cell, which of course they're saying evolved out of the primordial ooze. Both atheists, scientists, and creationists believe the theory that our whole universe started with the Big Bang. Where we differ is who lit the match. Okay? With even using imaginary numbers, they can't come up with how the explosion would have started. Where we just say, God said, make it happen, let there be light. Steve?
You know, being involved in this kind of discussion with evolutionists versus creationism, I'm convinced that this is not a scientific argument. This is a spiritual battle. Because what I've seen, I was just yesterday in the store looking through Scientific American magazine. Michael Shermer, who spoke here when Reasons to Believe was here, who was said he was a Christian, brought up at a Christian college. Seeing every month he writes an anti-Christian treatise in Scientific American to try to convince people that there is no God. And just reading what he wrote this month, this month convinces me that it's a spiritual battle, because they are desperate to find out any way they can explain away God, because they can't.
Yeah.
So I think when we engage in this discussion with evolutionists, we've got to present the scientific evidence, but we've got to remember it's a spiritual battle. It's not just, I'm going to disprove your argument.
Right. This is loose science at its best, okay? And at its worst, yeah, like Steve said. But most of what I read boils down to the evolutionists simply saying, we don't have the necessary tools. We haven't discovered what it takes yet to prove our side, but eventually we will. Look at how much we've proved since Darwin was around. We just need more time. So they're begging for more time. And yeah, what my point is we can give them all the time that they want, and they're never going to be able to prove the simultaneous development of multiple systems that interact together to provide feedback loops for any given system in our bodies, certainly, let alone many other animals in the animal world. Sandy?
Did you find in all your years of practice that doctors, during all of their years of practice, that they changed their mind, that maybe they started out as evolutionists?
I came across example, what Sandy's asking is, in my research or even in my practice, are there doctors that have changed their mind as they look into this? I don't think very many doctors look into this, first off. They're more concerned with, you know, the latest antibiotic that'll treat MRSA and VRE and that kind of stuff. But in my literature search, as I was preparing for this talk, I found many people that switched sides from evolutionists to creationism. They said there has to be an intelligent designer. I found nobody that went from intelligent design camp to the evolution side. There may be, but I didn't find anybody that claimed that they went that direction. So it's interesting, the more or the harder you seem to try and investigate and keep an open mind, the more you realize, you know, there's just either there's not enough time, the complexity is too great, the interaction of all of these systems is too incredible for evolution to be a straight explanation or a simple explanation for it. There has to be something that's guiding it or designing it. And as you study DNA, just DNA alone is enough to convince most of us that there has to be a designer. Because how do you know, anybody seen Microsoft Word come out of evolution? That's just ones and zeros. You know, our DNA is 1, 2, 3, 4 in various sequences and coding. And you don't put that stuff together by evolution. That's done by a design. Yeah, Bob.
As you're in the process of trying to save lives, now this is a bit outside of what you presented to us today, but have you anecdotally experienced miracles from God in the healing process?
Oh, yeah.
Things that you couldn't scientifically explain away, but that the Holy Spirit was at work, answering prayer, whatever you may have experienced.
I've seen so many of those types of examples. I mean, I've literally had patients I've pronounced dead who haven't had a heartbeat in 3 minutes, and I walk away from the bed, and then the nurse calls me back in 60 seconds. Dr. Reid, there's a heartbeat. Oh, great, another Lazarus here. Yeah, those are always embarrassing situations for me, but I have had any number of those, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
I had heard that all our cells in our body regenerate within a period of 7 to 10 years. They die. Is that? That's what. They come back half strength.
Well, remember that one slide that I showed you, that the cell is like a little microcosmic city, and it has the capability of restoring itself. If it's injured, it restores itself. Nerve cells take the longest to restore, but even they restore it. Even my wife with MS, she's constantly regenerating new myelin, but unfortunately she has antibodies that destroy that myelin and keep breaking it down, so it's a yin-yang type of a situation. Any others? Okay, let's pray. We're right at our time right now. Let's pray, and then we can go out into the world and preach creationism. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for the bodies that you've provided for each of us here on this earth. And we know that these bodies are going to fade away someday, and that we will take on a new creation given us by you, one that we can't even conceive of at this stage in our development. But we thank you for that promise. We thank you for the love that you envelop around us on a day-to-day basis. You keep us safe, you keep us from harm. And we just ask that you would continue to guide us and bless us in our lives for the days that you have ordained for us to be on this earth. And bless us as we go from here today. Be with us and let us be a shining light and salt of the earth for those that are around us, that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. In thy name we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys.